I stepped off the train platform with a torn suitcase and a belly nearly 6 months pregnant, carrying nothing but a small dream, a roof over my head, a fresh start. But within minutes, I was stripped of my dignity, my hope, and my trust in people. Branded as shameless and cast aside just because I was unmarried and expecting, I stood alone in the harsh West. No one beside me, no way back. Then a stranger appeared, asking no questions, demanding no explanations. He opened a door, but was he a savior or just the gateway to an even bigger storm? There are moments in life when a person thinks they're starting a brand new chapter, only to find they're being pushed off a cliff. For Rachel Bell, that moment came as the train wheels screeched along the parched tracks, kicking up red western dust that clung to the worn-out dress she'd chosen for what she believed was the most important day of her life, the day she thought would change everything. She had once dreamed of a peaceful home. After the death of her fiancé, the only man who had ever looked at her with genuine tenderness, Rachel believed all she had left was the baby growing inside her and the hope of a different future. Once again, she took a chance, replying to a mail-order bride advertisement, the kind many Western men used to find wives through letters. A man named Horace Keir had written back, his words filled with faith and family values. Rachel believed him. She hoped. She gambled every last penny on a train ticket to the frontier, where she would be a wife, a mother, and start over. But she had no idea that what awaited her on that sun-scorched platform wasn't love or a home, but a sentence, one steeped in prejudice, cold and unforgiving. Horace Keir stood at the far end of the platform. His gaze barely landed on Rachel's face before it dropped to her belly, the part she had tried to conceal beneath a tightly wrapped shawl. But nearly 6 months pregnant, how could she hide it? His brows furrowed, his lips tightened, and without him saying a word, Rachel knew the door had just slammed shut. "I'm Rachel Bell," she said softly, voice trembling. "The one who wrote to you. I did say I was a widow. You didn't say you were pregnant." His voice was like stone. "I hoped it wouldn't matter. I'm healthy. I can cook, so I just want to start again." "You should have made it clear from the beginning." He spat each word. "I don't want a ruined woman." That word, ruined, hit like a slap. No one on the platform stepped in. No one asked if she was okay. The whole world stood still, save for the burning sun and the red dust swirling in the silence. When Horace tore up the letter she had written with all her hope and sincerity, dropped it to the ground, and turned his back on her, Rachel was left with nothing but a torn suitcase, a few worn clothes, a weathered Bible, and the ribbon meant for a crib that would never be built. She didn't cry, not then. She only bent down, hands shaking, picking up each dust-covered belonging, trying to bury the shame that threatened to rise. But the town saw everything. A little boy pointed and asked his mother, "Why is she crying?" The mother pulled him away as if Rachel carried some kind of disease. No door opened, no kind voice called out. The saloon refused her a sip of water. The general store turned its back. She dragged her feet down every narrow street in town, each step heavier than the last, each stare cutting like a blade. They didn't care why. They only saw the belly and the missing wedding ring, and that was enough to convict her. Finally, she sat down on the porch of an abandoned stagecoach office where the sun dipped behind the red hills. She clutched her suitcase like it held the last remnants of the life she used to know. The baby kicked gently inside her, as if reminding her she couldn't give up. But all Rachel could whisper, her voice hollow and breaking, was, "I'm sorry, baby. I thought this was the beginning. Somewhere else, a pregnant woman might be cherished. But here, under the harsh gaze of a small town, she was a disgrace, a stain, a woman no one wanted. And that label boss hurt worse than any insult. Because it silenced Rachel. It bowed her head. It made her question if there was any space left in the world where she could survive. Footsteps echoed through the emptiness, snapping Rachel back to reality from her spiral of dark thoughts. She lifted her head, squinting against the harsh, late afternoon sun. A tall man was walking slowly toward her. His steps were steady, almost heavy, as if each one carried a weight from the past. His long coat was dust-covered, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed most of his face, revealing only a sharp jawline and sun-weathered skin. A pistol hung loosely at his side, but his hands were empty. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't eager. He simply was. A quiet presence. The same way he would later step into her life. Rachel stood up reflexively, taking a step back, her hands instinctively shielding her belly. The man stopped at the edge of the porch. He tilted his head slightly, gray eyes under the brim of his hat, looking up at her, then down at the torn suitcase and her swollen stomach. But unlike the other looks she'd received, his gaze wasn't prying, wasn't judgmental. It was simply understanding. Long enough to see, short enough not to shame. "Do you have anywhere to go?" His voice was low and unhurried, with a rough edge, like smoke and fire. Rachel shook her head gently. "No." "Anyone helping you?" Another shake, this time with a flicker of guarded suspicion in her eyes. He nodded, as if her answer was enough and didn't require justification. "There's a place at the edge of town, small, but the roof doesn't leak. Fire still burns in the stove. If you and the baby need somewhere to rest, you can go there." She narrowed her eyes, wary. "Why would you help me?" He shrugged, gaze drifting toward the darkening horizon. "Right or wrong, it doesn't matter much. But what happened to you? That ain't fair. No promises, no pity." He said it like it was just a simple truth. One person helping another because kindness still exists. Somewhere, even in a land hardened by judgment and selfishness. He reached out, not toward her, but toward the worn suitcase. "Come on, it's gonna rain." Rachel hesitated for a single breath, then nodded. She had nothing left to lose. And strangely, in those ash-gray eyes, she didn't see danger, only a silence that looked a lot like her own loneliness. Elias's cabin sat by a dry creek bed, nestled among thorny brush and sun-beaten rocks. A modest wooden shack, but clean, warm, and filled with signs of someone who lived with order. Blankets folded neatly, books stacked on shelves, a stove fire glowing steadily across the room. He placed the suitcase beside the old bed and quietly ladled a bowl of hot soup from a cast-iron pot simmering on the stove. They didn't speak much over dinner. He didn't ask about her past, and she didn't offer. But that silence brought more comfort than any kind words ever had. No need to defend herself. No need to explain. Just two people sharing the warmth of a fire, a bowl of soup, and a space without judgment. When she asked his name, he answered simply, "Elias. Elias Hart." The name sounded like a strange metaphor. Maybe for a man whose heart had survived the storm intact. Or maybe, like hers, his heart had once been shattered. And now he was trying to piece it back together. That night, as she lay on the old bed, her round belly shifting gently beneath the covers, Elias sat by the fire in a worn chair. He didn't leave the room. He didn't come close, either. He just stayed there like a quiet shadow, constant and steady. "Why are you helping me?" Rachel asked again in the deep dark, broken only by the flicker of firelight. "Because no one else would," he replied, voice soft but firm. "No one helped me when I needed it. I don't want to repeat that with someone else." Rachel turned her head toward him. She couldn't see his face, but she heard the truth in his voice, a truth that came from lived pain. Maybe Elias had once stood where she was now, abandoned with no one left. She asked nothing more, and he said nothing more. but something had shifted between them. Small, but real. A quiet thread now connected two strangers, both once cast aside, now sharing one roof, speaking little, but understanding plenty. The next morning, Rachel woke to the smell of coffee and the crackle of eggs frying in a pan. Sunlight streamed through the window, turning the little cabin into a place that almost felt unreal in this dusty land. Elias handed her a plate of food. You need rest. I'll head out to get a few things. She looked at him carefully. Will you come back? He didn't answer directly, just dipped his head and smiled. Lock the door behind me. And Rachel knew in that moment she was no longer truly alone. Ever since Rachel stepped across the threshold of Elias's cabin, something inside her began to soften. Not that her wounds had healed, far from it, but for the first time in months of wandering through cold stares and quiet contempt, she found herself in a home that didn't judge her. A place where her presence, pregnant belly, untold past, and eyes stripped of innocence was quietly accepted. At first, she kept her distance. Even though Elias never asked about the baby, the dead man who fathered it, or why she had fled west. Rachel still clutched her old coat tight against her body like armor, but each meal he set aside for her, each morning with the faint scent of coffee drifting over the hearth, each simple offer like, if you feel like reading, there's plenty of books on the shelf. Those small things slowly pulled the thorns from her heart. Elias didn't act kind. He was kind. In that rare way, only those who've suffered too much still choose to stand tall, live quietly, and endure with strength. He made no promises, offered no comforts, but she knew if she ever needed him, he would be there. Still, the town was not as kind. The rumors started, like they always do, from the tables of the town saloon, where idle men spat opinions like they were discussing the price of corn. That knocked-up girl. That's how it began. And from there, the whispers stuck to Rachel like cobwebs. Heard she seduced two men and ran away. She got kicked out of the East, they say. No one even knows if that baby's legal. The name Horace Keir, the man who had publicly humiliated Rachel at the train station, suddenly became the poor victim in the town's reimagined tale. He told anyone who listened that Elias had stolen his fiancée, that he'd been tricked by a shameless woman, that he had proof, letters, a marriage contract, sacred promises. The truth? No one cared. In a small town, truth rarely survives the volume of a lie. And Horace, with his slick, snake oil tongue, had all the volume he needed to turn slander into gospel. The warning came one morning when Sheriff Crane, the same man once known for minding his own damn business, pulled Elias aside outside the post office. You're stirring up too much dust, Hart. Horace is telling folks you stole his bride. Elias only said one thing. She doesn't belong to him. He threw her away, in front of a crowd. The sheriff sighed, pushing his hat up. Yeah, but you know how it is. Round here, folks don't need truth. They need something to hate. And right now, that's looking like the two of you. Elias nodded. If they come, they'll have to go through me first. When Elias told Rachel, she said nothing, but her hands trembled ever so slightly as she lifted her dinner plate, though not a drop spilled. After dinner, they sat quietly in the small cabin, his knife carving wood in a steady rhythm, her needle pulling thread through cloth, soft and slow. The pale blue fabric she had chosen to patch the baby's cradle swayed gently in the firelight. I dreamed the house was burning, she whispered, eyes fixed on her stitching. I couldn't find you, just me and the baby, in the smoke. Elias didn't look up. Just a dream. But the fire in that dream had a smell. A real smell. Like right now. That sentence, Rachel would remember it for the rest of her life, because 2 nights later her dream came true. She woke to the scent of burning, dry, choking smoke, the kind no one could mistake. "Elias," she screamed. He was already up, eyes sharp in the dark, rifle on his back. Flames were crawling up the back of the cabin, hungry and fast, devouring the dry wood like a starving beast. "Back door, go," he shouted, grabbing the torn suitcase she had clung to like treasure. Rachel held her stomach, legs shaking, but forced herself to run. Smoke swallowed everything. The home, the one safe place she had known, was splitting apart in the heat. A long, splitting creak, and then the roof collapsed, fire bursting toward the sky like hell itself had opened. They ran, stumbled, gasped for breath, hands locked, never letting go. When they reached the tree line, Elias pulled her behind a large rock. He stared back at the burning night, not like a man who fled, but like one calculating the price. "This wasn't an accident," Rachel gasped. "Someone tried to kill us." Elias said nothing, but his eyes, red and fierce in the firelight, said everything. He knew. She knew. Horace. Or one of his cowards. "Not us," Elias whispered. "They tried to kill you. And the baby." The words sent chills through her. Not from fear, but because for the first time the truth had been named. She grabbed his hand. For the first time, it was her reaching out. "I'm not afraid anymore." He looked at her. "And you're not alone anymore." The next morning they returned, stood before what used to be a warm little cabin. Ashes, charred wood, the half-sewn cradle, the Bible cover burnt through, all of it, blackened and broken. But among the wreckage, Elias found the old gun, hidden away, with his old name carved into the grip. E.H. Rachel looked at him and asked gently, "You hid your past here, didn't you?" He nodded, voice low. "That name, it's not mine anymore." She placed a hand on her belly, her eyes on him, steady, unwavering. "But the man standing here, the one who saved me, that man, I believe in." He turned away, silent. But inside he knew, for the first time after all his running, he had finally been seen. And forgiven. The ashes were still warm when Elias and Rachel returned to town. Both were blackened with soot, hair matted, hands blistered, and eyes, not fearful anymore, but blazing, like they'd just walked off a battlefield. The townsfolk stood along the sidewalks, behind curtains, in the saloon, and on their porches. Everyone looked. No one spoke, not because they didn't know, but because they knew too well. Word of the cabin fire had spread faster than the flames. People heard the screaming, saw the glow at the base of the hill, and witnessed Elias and Rachel running through the night like ghosts escaping hell. This time they weren't the pregnant girl and the quiet guy. They were living proof of a crime, a truth no one could deny. Sheriff Crane stepped out of the saloon, sun-worn face tight with concern. He looked them up and down, then muttered, "God, they really did it." Elias said nothing. Rachel didn't either, but when the sheriff asked, "Do you know who did this?" Elias simply replied, "Not yet." It was Rachel who stepped in. "But I know why they did it." Her voice didn't shake. There was no pleading, no excuse, just steel, tempered by fire. "I want a roof over my head," she said, "and a list of everyone who stood by while Horace Keir stirred that mob." The sheriff looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Rachel Bell, the girl once whispered about, was no longer a victim. She was a woman standing tall, ready to fight, and to the sheriff, that was both admirable and dangerous. They were given shelter in an abandoned cabin on the edge of town, smaller, rougher, but clean and solid. Strangely enough, things started to shift after that. An old man brought them a sack of flour. A carpenter dropped off wood without Rachel even asking. A schoolteacher stopped by, left a worn children's book, and whispered, "For a safe and peaceful birth, night." Not everyone was cruel. It's just, before, no one had the courage to be kind. But Rachel had crossed that line, and people, quietly, maybe not with logic, but with awe, began to believe maybe the girl was right. When Horace returned, he brought 7 men, armed with rifles and swords. They rode into town like a storm cloud swallowing the sunset. Horace hadn't changed. Light-colored coat, fake smile, and hollow eyes. He dismounted just steps from the new cabin, like he'd been invited. Came to reclaim what's mine. He grinned. Rachel stood at the door, hand resting on her heavily pregnant belly. Elias stood beside her, a rifle slung across his back. You cast me aside in front of a crowd, Rachel said loudly, loud enough for all of Main Street to hear. You called me filthy, a burden. You tore up my letters, spit on my trust. I owe you nothing. You're pregnant by another man. I have papers, I have rights. Horace barked. You have papers, but no honor, Rachel snapped. I'm not some item you can return like a bad trade. One of Horace's men reached for his weapon. Elias didn't hesitate. 1 second, one pull of the rifle, and a shot rang out. The man dropped, a bullet in his leg. The crowd gasped. Sheriff Crane stepped forward, this time not as a bystander. He raised his gun. We all saw it. Elias only fired when threatened. This is justice? Siding with liars? Horace shouted. This is truth, Sheriff replied. And this town is done with your lies. Horace stepped back. None of the men behind him moved. The same eyes that once looked away from Rachel's pain now turned toward her and saw something else. Fire didn't kill her, and neither could they. Horace was driven out, not with fists or force, but with the suffocating silence of a town that had finally changed. As the dust swallowed Horace and his men, Rachel turned back toward the cabin. Elias took her hand, not possessively, but in partnership. She squeezed back, for the first time, with honesty. I was so scared, she whispered. Scared no one saw me. Scared no one needed me. Elias didn't answer right away. He just placed his hand on her belly, where their child stirred gently. I see you, he said. Always have. That night, for the first time, Rachel slept without flinching at every knock. She knew. Maybe they hadn't won everything, but this time, they weren't running. And that changed everything. The end of season wind blew across the porch, carrying the scent of distant rain and the whispers of trees. In a small cabin on the edge of town, once a forgotten patch of land, Rachel Bell sat on a wooden chair, one hand resting on her swollen belly. She no longer hurried. She no longer flinched beneath the gaze of others. She just sat there, silent, fully aware of the life about to spill from her body, like a prelude to a new chapter in a life reclaimed. Elias stood not far off, shoulder leaning against a porch post, hands carving the final details into a small wooden horse. He didn't speak, but his eyes never left her, noticing every motion, every subtle shift of her belly. It wasn't fear. It was something he'd never known before. Anticipation. The baby came on a morning of rain. Thunder cracked across the sky like battlefield drums, but the small room was filled only with ragged breaths, muffled groans, and whispered prayers. Elias stayed by her side, not letting go for a second. The same hands once so familiar with guns and knives now gripped Rachel's sweat-slicked hand. And when the first cry rang out, loud, pure, like a silver bell echoing through the woods, Elias could hardly breathe. A baby girl, fierce, crimson-skinned, fists flailing like she was declaring to the world, I'm here, and you will not ignore me. Rachel cradled the baby in trembling arms, tears streaming down her face, not from pain, but because, for the first time in her life, she felt whole. I'm going to name her Hope, she whispered. Elias blinked, looking at her. Because she's our hope? Rachel smiled weakly. No, because she survived. So did I. So did you. So did this place. The days that followed passed like a dream. The little cabin slowly filled with the laughter of a child, the smell of fresh baked bread, and the sound of a hammer tapping wood as Elias expanded the porch into a play area for Hope. Every townsperson who stopped by, offering eggs, cloth scraps, or just a stiff hello, received a smile. Not one of bowed gratitude, but the smile of someone once cast aside, now teaching the world how to walk free of its judgment. Rachel never preached. She didn't apologize for surviving. She simply existed, day after day, as a living reminder that no one has the right to define a woman's worth by her belly or a torn up letter. And Elias, the man who once hid from his own name, now carved into the cabin door, heart and bell. Not a business sign, a family name. But every legend has its final test. And this one came in a familiar form. Horace Keir. He returned, not with guns or henchmen, but with a smile and apologies far too late. He said he had thought it over, that he was just upset, that he wanted the child to have a legal father. Rachel held hope as he spoke. She didn't scream. She didn't rage. She simply laid her daughter in the cradle and walked out onto the porch. "You're not here to apologize," she said. "You're here to see if I'm still afraid." "Rachel, I don't." Her voice was like stone. "I almost died in the fire you set." But the scariest part wasn't the flames. It was thinking I had no right to exist. You took that from me. And Elias gave it back. You can't take anything else. Horace stood still, staring at her, and for the first time he nodded. Not in regret, but in the quiet admission of complete defeat. Not in a fight, but in how history would remember him and her. Years later, the children in town still whisper stories about the house by the woods where a woman lived after her home was burned and still stood tall. They don't know all the details, but they've heard there was once a pregnant woman rejected by the world who chose to keep her child anyway. That there was once a man with a gun who ran from his past, but chose to stay for the one person no one else believed in. That in a harsh town, a family once rose from ashes. Elias aged in quiet peace, his hair turning silver as Hope began learning to ride. Rachel taught her to read, to sew, and to never bow her head to anyone who dared call her different. Each evening they sat on the porch where the sunset painted the fields gold, and Hope would often ask, "Mom, why did you name me Hope?" Rachel would smile and run her fingers through her daughter's hair. "Because before you came, I had nothing left. But the moment I heard you cry, I knew I still had me." And that's how legends are born. Not from blood or bullets, but from the choice to rise after being thrown into the dark. No one remembers where Horace Keir went after that, but everyone remembers Rachel Bell, the woman with the torn letter, the burned house, and the name they once spat, who chose not to die. And Elias Hart, the man with no name who chose to stay. The story is still told, not through books, but through action. Because sometimes the ones cast aside aren't the weakest. They're the ones who start something new,